I have to confess, while I was listening to Don speak about the communion, he was mentioning, the thing with the beard and being the homeless guy, and Jesus is that homeless guy. And I kept thinking, well, maybe if Jesus just shaved, he wouldn't have been that homeless guy. But then I started thinking a little more seriously. I said, well, what if, especially in light of our conversation this morning, we grew out our beard to become that homeless guy just so that we would know where that homeless guy lived and dwelled and went. Because don't you kind of feel like Jesus became that homeless guy so that he could reach out to that homeless guy? Say, look at that, Don. Nice job. Thank you, Don. Now, I had Crystal and Alan and Janie and Carrie. They were all over at our house for Thanksgiving Day. And we were over there, and I was trying to make, we went all out for Thanksgiving dinner, and I was making all kinds of stuff, and they were helping me with this. And I went to make some Kool-Aid, and it has this little rib pouch, and you pour it in there, and you mix the water in, right? Well, I go to rip the pouch, and guess what happened? Everywhere. I go, oh, seriously? And it wasn't that so much stuff with me as what happened next, because Crystal comes back and she goes, it's never going to go as expected, right? Everything's not going to work out perfectly. And it's not what she said that was so great as why she said it. Because she was quoting me from a year ago. And so it wasn't even so much what was said, or the fact that she remembered what I said, word for word, a year ago. Whoa! I gotta say, I was kind of impressed. I mean, she was paying attention. How many of you can say that you can remember something I said word for word a year ago today? That's not easy to do, is it? I mean, sometimes when I do the preaching, generally I have a general rule, okay? There are times where I will take a sermon I've used before, retouch it up, and use it again. Now, my general rule is the sermon has to be at least 2 years old to be able to retouch and use it again, because I don't want it to be fresh, recent in your memory. But the problem is, what I found is, no matter how old a sermon is, if I have a visual illustration involved in it, I can't ever reuse it. Because you'll remember it. And so Crystal's remembering that just got me thinking, because there was another thing. She did this once to me before, only this one was about the diaper and the Reese's Pieces and the chocolate and about how what's on the inside, I mean what we represent on the outside changes our perception of what's on the inside. And just thinking, how do we get those things to stick with us? How do we remember what's been said years and years and years ago? Because I do think that there are many things that I said last week that you've already forgotten. But I also think that there are things I said 4 or 5 years ago that you can remember at a drop of a hat if I used the appropriate illustrations to get it through. Visual illustrations are very difficult to come by, but they can be so effective when used at the appropriate times and not overused. Sometimes visual illustrations are necessary because we just learn differently, right? Some of us, we need to see to learn, to understand, and to hold on to something. Some of us need to have something in our hands to hold on to, right? Some of us learn better just by hearing. But sometimes, you know what? Sometimes we need to see it and have a visual illustration just because, heaven forbid, because I know none of you ever do this, we're not paying attention. Right? Sometimes we need to see, touch, and feel because we're not paying attention. I'll be honest, sometimes I apologize, Fred, but sometimes I'm not always listening as well as I should when you're doing announcements. And I know that a couple times I've said something that you've already said before because I haven't been listening as well as I should have. I think we all at various times, whether we're tired, whether we don't like the subject that's being talked about, whether we've got our own opinion on what's being talked about. We have our times, our places where we drown things out. And so we need something to break us out of that laziness, I think would be a good way to put it. Sometimes it's not that we can't believe, but it's that we won't believe. I think as we we can relate this back into the Christmas story. Why did Jesus come? Did Jesus come because we can't believe? Or did Jesus come because we won't believe? Did Jesus come because we couldn't understand and we weren't hearing the words of God? Or did he come because we weren't paying attention to the words that we had heard? I think we can see this to some degree when we look at the story of doubting Thomas. Now this is another one of those challenges, okay, about getting you to remember things when it comes to Christmases. Because the Christmas story can only be preached so many times in so many different ways before you're doing the same text every year, right? And so you've got to work. I think this is the hardest sermon of the year, every year for me, is trying to figure out what to do the week before Christmas. Because this is another one of those things, if I just preach a good old Christmas sermon, it's going to be just like every other good old Christmas sermon, and guess what, a year from now, you're not going to know if I did anything different at all. So what can I do? Well, this wouldn't be the first place you guess we're going to go. I think we can see this story reflected in the story of doubting Thomas, in the story of the doubting Thomas story, okay? In John chapter 20. That's what we're going to look at today. John chapter 20. I think we can see what is going on with the coming of Jesus and Christmas reflected in what's going on in John chapter 20. So look over to John 20, verse 24 through 29. John chapter 20, verse 24 through 29. It is up behind me as well. You don't have to turn it if you don't want to. John chapter 20. It says, Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So, 12 disciples had assembled together. Well, 12 minus 2, minus Judas and Thomas, right? They had assembled together, and Jesus had come after the resurrection and appeared to him. But Thomas was missing. So the other disciples told him, We have seen the Lord. But he said to them, there's that famous line, right? Unless I see in his hands the marks of the nails, and not only just see it, but I have to put my finger inside of it, right? Place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side. That's a little grotesque, isn't it? I will never believe. 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, Peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. Thomas answered him, My Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Now, just to make sure this sticks, go ahead and put the next one up there. There we go. So now you're going to read this, you're going to laugh, and you're going to remember it, right? If you can't read it, I'll read it to you, okay? The guy on the left is Thomas. And he's saying, all I'm saying is, we don't call Peter denying Peter, or Mark ran away naked Mark. Why am I saddled with this title? And then the guy on the right says, I see your point, Thomas, but really, it's time to move on. Oh, why do we got to call Doubting Thomas? You know, that would be a terrible name to be stuck with, wouldn't it? Doubting Thomas. All the stuff you've done, you get stuck with Doubting Thomas. So, why? Did we ever ask him why? Why does Thomas doubt? It isn't just a matter of Thomas doubted and didn't believe what they said, but why? What's going on back there that he doesn't believe them? Well, first of all, it's because he wasn't listening. It's not, again, we want to stress, it's not that he couldn't believe, it's that he would not believe. Thomas wasn't listening. In John chapter 8, it's just one example. There's a couple in there. It's not going to be out there. In John chapter 8, Jesus prophesied, he says, I am going to die in 3 days, rise again. Okay, he told them this would happen, didn't he? Thomas didn't understand. Was it that Thomas didn't understand, or was he not listening? Why does Thomas doubt? Well, we said he wasn't listening, but he wasn't understanding. How many times do we see throughout the Gospels Jesus speaking to the disciples, and the disciples go, huh? Right? There's two other instances in the Gospel of John where Thomas speaks up. In chapter 11, verse 16, there... I lost my track here. Forgive me. Chapter 11, verse 16. Lazarus dies, right? Okay, but Lazarus is in Judea. They can't go into Judea because they're going to stone Jesus and stone the disciples. They just fled across the Jordan because they were afraid, right? So Jesus says, okay, we're going to go see Lazarus. All the disciples go, oh no, we're not going to do that. But Thomas, chapter 11, verse 16, so Thomas called the twin and said to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Wasn't exactly what Jesus was talking about, was it? Thomas may have heard at times, but he didn't understand. Another example was in chapter 14, verse 15. Chapter 14, verse 5. Jesus is talking about that he's going to his Father's house to prepare a room for them. And Thomas says, Lord, we do not know where you're going. How can we know the way? Thomas is thinking in earthly terms. You know, he's going to Damascus. He's going to Caesarea. Well, if you just tell us where you're going, we can get there. But you're not telling us. Jesus is speaking in heavenly terms. So it's again, Thomas does not understand. So, why does Thomas doubt? First of all, he's not listening. Number two, he doesn't understand when he is listening. Why else? Why else does Thomas doubt? Because he's overcome by his own circumstances. This is the big one, and I think this can oftentimes be the hardest for all of us. Life is happening all around us, and it blinds us to the reality of things. It blinds us to the reality of who God is and what God has promised for us. See, why were the disciples gathered in a room with locked doors? Well, chapter 20, verse 19 says, because they were afraid. They were afraid of what the Jews were going to do to them. Their rabbi, Jesus, was just crucified. When he came to be arrested, what did the rest of the disciples do? They ran away because they were afraid. And so now Thomas is so overwhelmed with all these things going on around him that he cannot hope to believe that Jesus could have rose from the dead. That it really could be that good. There's too many other things going on. This doesn't sound familiar at all, does it? Right? I know that Jesus says, if I forgive always, he will give us peace and rest and so on and so forth. But it's too hard, not in this circumstance. Right? We make excuses. We've got other things going on, and our other things are bigger than God's things. And so therefore God's things are out the door. So Thomas may have heard, and he may have understood some things, but he refused to believe them because all the troubles surrounding him. So Thomas doubted because he wasn't listening, he wasn't understanding, and he was overcome by his own circumstances. There's another story about Thomas. It's not in the Gospels. It's actually a bit of a funny story. It's from a book called The Acts of Thomas. It's not a real story, but it kind of plays on this one. And this one's worth telling just because it's funny, and it kind of goes along with the point. In this one, in the Acts of Thomas, the disciples, they gather together and they split up the whole world. Who's going to go where? Right? And Thomas draws India. Thomas says, I don't want to go to India. And he refuses. And so the disciples try to convince him and it doesn't work. So Jesus shows up, right? This is the resurrected Jesus. He came back down, he shows up. There is this king in India called Gandhar. And he wants to build a palace. So he sends a royal official to Jerusalem to look for a carpenter. Jesus shows up to this royal official and says, hey, I've got a carpenter for you. And then Jesus, without Thomas's knowledge, sells Thomas as a slave to Gandhar. Then he calls Thomas and says, Thomas, come on over here. And so Thomas comes on over, and the royal servant, he looks at Thomas and goes, is this your master? Pointing at Jesus. Thomas says, yeah, that's my master. And so completes the sale, and Thomas goes to India. Now, mind you, that's not a true story, but it's a funny one, and it's worth sharing because it kind of relates our saying, I mean, do we really want to be put in that kind of boat? Because Jesus is not going to sell us as a slave, okay? He's not going to come out and trick us. I mean, it sounds pretty underhanded, doesn't it? This is pretty contradictory to the character of who Jesus is. But don't we see some stories like Jonah, or like Saul on the road to Damascus, where God said, you can only seek to overcome my will so many times before I'm going to step in and do something. We need to understand the difference between not having the ability to believe and not having the will to believe. It's not that Thomas couldn't believe, it's that Thomas would not believe. It's not that the world could not believe. It's that the world would not believe. In the incarnation, the birth of Jesus, God is addressing all of these problems. I want you to imagine that like a sermon illustration, so to speak, okay? God's been speaking to us all for how long now, and nobody's listening. And so he sends down Jesus. All right, this will get through to them. This will wake them from their stupor. This will cause them to pay attention. He sends down his only Son. Why does the world not know God? Why does the world, like Thomas, doubt? Why were they unable to receive peace? Well, just like Thomas. Because they aren't listening. Isaiah 65:12, and quite a few other places. The last half of Isaiah, and we should note this if you were in a Wednesday night class, mentions over and over again, but they did not listen. But they did not listen. God went, listen, 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 over and over again. Why did the world not know God? Why did Jesus come? Because they did not listen. Why does the world not know God? Because they don't understand. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 3. They don't understand. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's crib, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Why does the world not know God? Because they aren't listening. Because they don't understand. And because they're overcome by their own circumstances. Because we are overcome by our own circumstances. Jeremiah 42:11. Do not fear the king of Babylon of whom you are afraid. Do not fear him, declares the Lord, for I am with you to save you and to deliver you from his hand. That's what God said, but what did they do? It's not that they could not believe that God would save, but it's that they would not believe that God would save because they were overcome by their circumstances. So just like Thomas, why did Jesus have to show up before Thomas? Because he would not listen, he would not understand, and he was overcome by his own circumstances. Why did Jesus come down for us? Because we were not listening, because we did not understand, because we were overcome by our own circumstances. Essentially, because of these reasons, the world and us with Thomas have said, I will not believe until I see. God was calling his children back to him by giving them a sign, a different kind of communication that could not easily be overlooked or forgotten. You may have heard him preach in the synagogue, but if you were Zacchaeus climbing that tree, and you had Jesus come and say, I'm going to stay with you, and you had him stay with you in your house overnight, are you going to believe? Are you listening now? Right, those good old Verizon commercials, can you hear me now? Right? God was calling his children back to him. Even if you're not paying attention, even if you're not paying attention to God at all of that commotion around Jesus, it would cause you to lift up your head and look. Even if you're sleeping in service, right? If I get something good and loud or a good picture up here, right? You're going to look and see what it is. You may not pay attention to anything, but you look up to notice that. what's going on? Wait, what is Brenda laughing at back there? Right? So you're going to have to stop and see what's going on. Do you think that Thomas expected Jesus to show up when he said those words? You think he expected him to just kind of appear in the room after he said, I'm not going to believe it until I touch and see? And he's probably hoping he wouldn't, right? He didn't expect him to show up. Instead, he was probably justifying his lack of faith. He had a lack of faith, and he knew it. And he's got 10 other disciples telling him right there that Jesus was there. I mean, where was Thomas? Why wasn't he there? Maybe he's feeling guilty that he wasn't there. So, what happened? What was the end result of Jesus showing up? What did Jesus showing up to Thomas do? Well, first of all, we know that Jesus showing up, he died to save Thomas and all of humanity. He saved Thomas, right? But what did it do to Thomas specifically? All right. What does Thomas immediately say? My Lord and my God. Do you know that is the only proclamation of that in the Gospel of John? That is the defining moment in the Gospel of John, where Thomas stands up and says, my Lord and my God. Never in the Gospel of John has the name of God and that mastership been put together in one phrase like that. This is the defining, the peak moment of the Gospel of John. It comes from the lips of Thomas. It's a big deal. But Thomas also doesn't fail to be with the disciples when they are gathering again. Thomas learned, okay, when you don't go to church, you miss stuff, right? When you don't go to church, you miss stuff. Not just, okay, I should have known about that, but there's something going on here that matters to the rest of our lives. Thomas didn't skip again. We look through the book of Acts, and he's not mentioned by name. But over and over again, there are the 12. And guess who's among the 12? Thomas. He's at Pentecost, so he didn't miss that. Imagine what would happen if he missed that. He didn't miss that. He became a teacher. Acts chapter 4. He became a teacher and a leader in the church. Doesn't sound like doubting Thomas anymore, does it? In the face of persecution, Peter and John were arrested for preaching the gospel at the temple. But do you know what happened the next day? All 12 of the disciples showed up and decided to preach right after they had been released. But you know, it says the rest of the church was afraid. The rest of the church wouldn't do it. But the 12, they set an example and did it. Doesn't sound like doubting Thomas, does it? Tradition also says, and this is tradition beyond just the Acts of Thomas, but this is verifiable tradition. It tells us that Thomas went on as a missionary to Persia, and to India, and to Sri Lanka, preaching the gospel. Can you imagine? Can you imagine going to such places today? Let alone going to them then, where there were no established trade routes. There were no established roads. You're literally going through the wilderness trying to find a way to get to India. Eventually, he was martyred there. What did Jesus showing up do to Thomas? And by extension, what does Jesus showing up on Christmas do to us? God has looked at us, he said over and over, they aren't listening, and he sent his Son. We've essentially said with the rest of the world, I will not believe until I see and touch. And Jesus said, all right, here you go. Now that he showed up and there's egg on our face, what are we going to do about it? Jesus has seen all the things that are keeping us back from faith. And on Christmas, he came down in the flesh, overcoming every one of those things. Just like with Thomas, he said, see my hands and my side, touch, see. One of the most amazing things about the story of Thomas is, why doesn't Jesus rebuke him? What do you mean you're not going to believe? What do you mean you have to touch? Seriously, Thomas? How dare you, Thomas? He says, all right, you now believe. Now do something about it. Jesus didn't come down and say, you know why I have to be here? Because you guys are so screwed up you don't even listen. No, he didn't say that, did he? Instead, Jesus came down, and as we talked about again this morning, he sought out those who had the most stuff and the thickest heads and everything clogged in their ears. Jesus came down for the bull-headed and thick-skulled. And he didn't even call them bull-headed or thick-skulled. That's a good thing, too. He did not come to rebuke us for our unbelief, but to enable us to believe. Jesus knew that it's not that we could not believe, but that we would not believe. But he works with us even in spite of that. In Christmas, Jesus came to save us and to change us. How has the coming of Christ changed you? How will you allow Jesus showing up to impact your life and your choices